Good morning and welcome to Living in the Promised Land, an immigrants' rights podcast. My name is Mark Schmuller, your host, and um, just got back from 2 weeks in Central America, Nicaragua, and I'll talk about some of my experience there, talking to people who just came up to me because or that I was speaking with that had family um, in the U.S. and were very worried about them, no matter what their immigration status was. And I talked to some people who have been living in the United States and recently went back to Nicaragua on their own and uh, talking about some of the differences, especially under the current climate. So, I learned some things, and we'll talk about that. And you all have been watching what's still been going on in Minnesota. People there are extremely brave, getting out on the streets. Um, it's awakened the community, and it's a horrible thing that's happening, but it's a really encouraging to see the response. And the there's a little short update from our alligator Alcatraz reporting that the judge in that case that we've talked about has given the government 21 days to respond with specifics regarding whether the uh, United States federal government was involved in building Alligator Alcatraz. Because remember, the reason that the state of Florida is arguing that it is not an ICE facility, but it is a state facility which is privately run, which is eh, one of the most bogus arguments one could make because immigration is not enforced locally. It Immigrants are detained locally, but the jurisdiction over them has nothing to do with the state of Florida. But they are arguing now to exempt themselves from having to have had an environmental impact law, which is federal, from having and other regulations regarding the conditions of the site itself. So that's something that just came yesterday. And obviously, the government has 21 days and justice can work really slow, as we know there. So, with that said, we have a guest today, a very special guest, Ted Gong, the executive director of the 1882 Foundation. 1882, the year that the Chinese Exclusion Act passed. And Ted, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Looking forward to exchanging various ideas about our history and some of the objects and things that we're trying to objectives and things we're trying to accomplish with the foundation. Great.
Okay. So,
Yeah, so
Ted, tell us what is the 1882 Foundation?
well, the 1882 is the year in which the first Chinese exclusion law was passed by Congress, and it's probably the first. We nowadays talk about comprehensive employment laws and stuff. That was probably the first. In fact, it was the first time in which the United States had comprehensive laws about who can come to the United States and who would be ineligible. And the 1882 laws, though, was targeted primarily at Chinese. And it basically had two very critical provisions, which says most Chinese people, and it was not everyone, but all could not come to the United States because they were Chinese. They could not immigrate to the United States unless you were a diplomat, a business person, or a scholar. So, and then the second part, probably even more consequence than the prohibition against Chinese coming to the United States. Obviously, the laws were targeted to Chinese laborers, but the other provision that is even more important, I would argue, than who can actually come to the United States was a provision that said Chinese could not become American citizens. They could not naturalize or become what we call naturalize and become American citizens.
So, when did can you give us a little bit history of when Chinese nationals first started to come to the United States, why and where?
Well, I would say that much of the immigration, the large immigration, we could say this. Often people would say, Chinese migration and immigration and Asian immigration started at almost the same time the United States was here. After all, Boston Tea Party was about importing tea from China that started the revolution, correct? And there we have people in the Civil War, Chinese Americans who were fighting in the Civil War, both sides of the
Mm,
of the conflict. That's another story which is fascinating. But I would say the large immigration numbers came, or people coming to the United States from China occurred during the gold rush periods. And that was the California gold rush attracted people from everywhere. And that included from China as well. And so that was probably the first large numbers in the 1840s to California. And then afterwards, I started building California in the West, and particularly the Transcontinental Railroad. So we're talking about the 50s and 60s, and you begin to say, there's not enough laborers to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And one of the things that somebody hit on the idea, they didn't know it was a great idea at that time. Let's hire the Chinese that are around here working on gold mines or in timber and things of this sort. Check, see how they work. They worked out so well. It was so good that they began to make up almost 80 to 90% of the entire workforce for the Central Pacific Railroad. That's the part. Remember that Continental Railroad was built with one company building from Sacramento heading into toward Utah, and from the other side going east, and they would meet in the middle promontory. The portion that was building from Sacramento was the Central Pacific Railroad, and those guys hired Chinese. And by the end of the construction, when the Golden Spike was put in at Promontory, almost 80 to 90% of the workforce was Chinese. And they were working so well that the railroad actually sent people to China to recruit laborers to come work on the railroad.
well, it's interesting because I think I mentioned to you, I mean, I wanted to do a sort of section on history when things cool down enough, but things aren't going to cool down. We're going to get, in the present, but it's so important that people understand this. And an example, which really struck me was, I think I told you one of my, I was waiting for an immigration interview for a client, and his mom, U.S. citizen, born and raised here, and mom from Georgia, from Forsyth, Georgia, which had its own civil rights background and had been a civil rights, you know, advocate in her day, and her brother was is a college professor historian, and she was told me she saw me reading a book about the Dillingham Commission, which we're going to talk about later, and she asked me about it as we were waiting, and I told her, and she said, "Well, she and her husband retired. They were just in Truckee, California. Well, I don't. I've been to California several times, but I'm not. I'm a very East Coast person, so I don't know the geography. But it sounded like a weird town. And she said that when they were there, there was a roadside that said, this what that told the history of the Chinese community there and how vibrant it was, and it was a railroad community, and it was driven out of town for the most part. The community was driven out of town, and she said all that was left was the pharmacy, which was the center, and somehow that was left. But she then, once she saw the plaque, she did a walking history tour of that, and I said, wow, this is how much uh, public history. Is where we learn, and how much I mean, somebody with an advanced degree, retired, had no idea, and so talk about like these communities and what happened, because it wasn't just that people were workers, but they were actually building communities, right?
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up because there's so much in the Chinese American experience, right? From the 1840s we just talking about to even what we're talking about now in, say, the Truckee area after, related to the railroads, you
And
know,
that's like Tahoe
and
for
it's like
for
Tahoe.
people.
So,
Yeah,
so
so for
yes.
those of us.
So for people who don't know, Truckee is just below Lake Tahoe. So we're between California and the Nevada borders, right? Truckee's in Nevada side. In any case, that site area is 10 miles from where the Transcontinental Railroad crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains from, remember, it started in Sacramento. The western part started in Sacramento. Then it had to go through the Central Valley, then up the mountains, through the Sierra Nevada mountains, cross over into Nevada, and continue on to meet the Union Pacific Railroad, which is building east from Omaha, right? So the ability, if anybody who is a skier or who has been, you know what that mountain site is like. It is a magnificent site, but it is almost solid granite, right? I mean,
Mm.
there's so much granite, and then you remember now in those days, we're talking about the 50s and 60s, 1850s, 80s. Don't have any power drills. You don't have any energy, that sort of stuff like this, electric drills. You don't even have dynamite. Dynamite wasn't widely used at that time. We're talking about just the end of the Civil War. So you're all still talking about black powder and gunpowder and things like that. Toward the end of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Central Pacific began experimenting with a chemical explosive. You know what that was? That was nitroglycerin. That was the first time they ever used nitroglycerin and applied it to an engineering project of that scale. At the end of the
Whoa.
day, at the end of the day, they had to create chemists at the railroad sites because it was such an unstable chemical that people would just get blown up transporting it up to the thing. Then after the construction of the railroad, they didn't use it for other railroads because until it became more stable. And then, of course, at that time, dynamite begins to be used more frequently. So anyway, that's some of the setting that talks about not only the fact that we're talking about laborers and the building, constructing of these things, where we're talking about blood, sweat, and just perseverance. We're talking about a whole difference, emergence of technology and the beginning of the Transcontinental Railroad and this sort of stuff. And so anyway, Truckee is there as that side. So just as you cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, you have to railroads even today don't do well in anything above a 15% grade. So you have to keep your rail bed at 15% elevating or declining, right? So the thing is
Mm.
that required you to create tunnels. You couldn't just build on top of the mountains and go across or go around.
Mm.
So you had to create tunnels. There were 15 tunnels built
Wow.
between Sacramento from the time they started climbing the mountains, going up the mountains, to the time that they came out on the Truckee. Truckee's 10 miles from the Summit Tunnel. But anyway, there's a couple other tunnels go, but 15 tunnels. They had to bore 15 tunnels at 15% slot. Anyway, uh, that was largely built by Chinese labor.
So was there something that Chinese workers here had that was learned uh, regarding like using granite, or was it learned here, or is it?
I mean, one of the arguments by Stanford and these people says, let's go hire the Chinese. After all, they built the Great Wall. They should be able to do this, right? Something
Mm.
like that. But another kind of the argument was they're so small compared to the giant Irishman we're trying to bring in, or the Scottish worker that's built from the other side coming over here. And so there was a big question of whether they could do the work. The key was, you know what it was, Mark, was they stayed and worked. They worked in crews. And the problem with the white labor that was coming from the East is they didn't hang around to build the hard parts of the railroad. So they
Well, didn't
couldn't
they want to come out for gold? Didn't they want
they
to take the they
that
want to
and
gamble?
also uh, well, of course people are gambling and they're doing
No,
very
but I mean gamble on gold. Gamble on
yeah,
gold.
yeah, gamble on
Yeah.
gold, or they got the ride to California. The Civil War is over. They're looking for new opportunities, and there's all kinds of opportunities in California, whether you're
Mm.
growing things or you're trying to do not lumber or anything like that. In any case, they did not want they did not have any of the perseverance to stay and build the railroad for all the digging, the dynamiting, the climbing of the mountains and so forth. The Summit Tunnel, which is the highest tunnel of those 15 tunnels, it's built at an elevation of almost 7,000 feet above square feet level. It is the length of that tunnel. I can give you the 1,000 plus 500 some odd feet. But the other way to look at it is if we think in terms of football fields, right? You and me, or the high school football or something like that. And you could take three football field lengths next to each other, football fields next to it. That was the distance of the tunnel that the Chinese built at that, what we call tunnel number 7. And that's the Summit Tunnel. And that Summit Tunnel, again, we're doing it with handheld spikes and things of this sort, right? Dynamite. You knock in a few inches a hole and you plug it in with gunpowder, black powder. You light the fuse and you run like heck out of the place, and it blows up. And so that then you send another crew in to just pick up the debris and move on to get to the next level, next level, next level. And that process was measured in inches per day. That's how, and so you had to build, remember this tunnel, which you and I used to run 100 yards for, yeah, to do this. But they were doing that, and they actually were building this through almost this particular tunnel. The highest and the longest of the tunnel was uh, uh, built half of it over 2 seasons or 3 seasons. And if you are a snow skier and you know Lake Tahoe and the ski area there is some of the best skiing area you've ever been in. But the reason it is also the heaviest snows of any place in the United States. And that was true during the 1840s, 50s when the Chinese were building, so that the people who built railroad workers who had built year-long round actually had a camp there almost for 2.5 years during the summer, during the winter. They would build during the winter. Now, can you imagine what it was like, Mark, during those snow, what we call it? We were scared of several feet of snow, but
No,
but
not
these
even
guys were building in their
inches.
camps. They had to dig through snow tunnels to get to the site.
And if one of them got hurt,
They would
they were
just
going to
get,
bleed
well,
out.
if they got hurt or any of this sort. That's another interesting story about what
Yeah.
how the crews were made. But the point was that it's really, there it is something remarkable, something that all laborers should to take pride in knowing that there were people like you and me at one point, my father and mother, who actually built this thing and constructed it. You know, the building of that particular tunnel was going so slow that, of course, you know that the engineers can figure out how you go from east to west and meet in the middle, right? Engineers would figure that out. But they decided that they were going to climb to the very top of the summit and drop a 75 to 80-foot shaft to the middle of where they expected the two eastern side and the western side to meet. And what they did was they created this tunnel that allowed them to drop people, workers, down to the middle of where the tunnel was supposed to be made. And this allowed them to form 2 additional crews in addition to the one that was going eastward and the one that was going westward. You went down to the very middle and you created 2 crews that built outward. So you actually have 4 sites of Chinese crew building to make this tunnel. And then when it was finished, they were only like inches off. So it's a great engineering feat as well. I think it was probably one of at that time, it was one of the railroads that were built at the highest elevation in the world.
So
So
were the workers like involved? They were involved in the strategic planning, as they say, of how this was done, or and some
so
of the engineering.
so the engineering was, of course, done by trained engineers. A lot of the people coming out from after the Civil War, they were coming in. And so But the Chinese weren't involved in that process. They were primarily the laborers or the managers of the laborers, right?
Okay.
And so they made contributions along the way, and some of them included like building along sheer shafts, I mean sheer cliffs. How do you dig the foothold that allow you to create the railroad bed that allowed the railroads and locomotives to cross across sheer cliffs? There's a famous story or there's a famous picture, and it's questionable whether it really is true. The Chinese thought one way to do it is like what we did before in China, which was to have people slung downward from the above area
Mm.
in baskets. And then you go on the baskets, you find out where the crate is, and you put your dynamite and you blow it up, and that creates your foothold for your railroad bed, right? That is probably a little myth, but there was a lot of people in the reporting the building of the stories uh, mentioned that the Chinese thought of building this method as a way of getting uh, building along sheer cliffs and then creating that bedway for the railroad other workers to come in and they create the rest of the railroad, right?
Mm.
So
So the workers and they have their families here at first?
no, this is primarily, this is not, later on, as we talk about Chinese exclusion laws, there will be a law that specifically addresses Chinese women and saying that they cannot come because they were Chinese women, afraid of them being women of ill repute, right? Things of this sort. So that was the Page Act, and that was in the 1870s. But of course, what's going on here is not much different from what is going on in many of the labor projects that are going on anywhere in the world. You have able-bodied men and people looking to build this sort of heavy duty work. And that was for the Chinese, it was the same way. They were primarily sons or fathers or men, and they didn't have families. They just, as a crew, they went in and were building this thing.
Mm. Okay. So,
And that's no different from, say, the Irish and the other people building eastward. Of course, you have camp followers and all this other stuff going along. That's not so much the case in the Chinese situation, but certainly in
so the communities were mostly men, where they were living as.
the communities were mostly men. So let's back up a little bit. These are people that are laborers building the railroad and following the construction of the railroad. So you're talking about building camps and things of this for the building of the railroads. Then when the railroad moves to the next 10 miles or 20 miles, you move again with the railroad, right? So
Understood.
other than the camp at the tunnel at the summit tunnel site, which was large, it was really a central site where trains and storehouses and stuff like that were there, and the Chinese were there for a year plus, but maybe 2 years. But and then so that you really, when you're talking about the formation of communities might be growing along the way as shopping places or things like stores and things like that, and they become the core of what would become Chinatowns or communities. But
So who's
I,
running the stores?
so you do have people who of course you of course you've already had a long experience of Chinese gold miners and stuff like this in this area, right? And they begin to get into other places, particularly timber, and then particularly things like uh, 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 retail shops, or things like sundry shops and things of this sort. So you have that phenomenon beginning to be the basis by which places like, and then you have the railroad community coming in to set up their offices, to keep their expanding and all this sort of stuff. So you do have people with little town needs and so forth. And so Chinese would be fulfilling that. It could be for laundry, but a lot of it was laundry, restaurants, things of this sort. So
And it was still
so
men.
Truckee was one of
Yeah.
those gathering spaces for all the railroad interests and the
Mm.
timber interests and things of this sort. Uh, the study of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is what we kind of focus on, you really have to understand how much the Transcontinental Railroad and the construction of the railroad in all its aspects affected the entire state and the nation, right? Everything from allowing goods from the east eventually to come over here, but also to allow for goods and industry being developed in California, Oregon, going back west. I mean, eastward, right? Those things all had needs that were built up. And Chinese were also just like every other railroad worker or other workers, saying there's opportunity here. The thing about the Chinese and Truckee and all along the way is after the railroads constructed, finished in the 1869, there's some buildings on the 70 side of things, but there was a huge depression. That's the main reason, a huge economic depression, partially carried on because the Civil War is finally catching up, right? With all this stuff. But that then creates the need for scapegoats. That creates the need of a lot more competitions for the building of the shops and the towns and so forth. And that results in, and a lot of the racism that came out from the Civil War probably migrated to California as well. And the result of that is you have these anti-Chinese purges. And that happened in Truckee as well as other places. So,
Yeah, so what happened in Truckee that was on that sign? Uh what happened there?
well, basically, there's a huge move. And it's not just Truckee, but there's that whole area and whole California begins to have these anti-Chinese laws, right? And basically, the anti-Chinese laws, we can understand them by what's happening in many places around here. But is this place belongs to white Americans who are defined as minors and things of the sort, and the Chinese can't have a portion of it. We're going to drive you out. You guys, you Chinese guys, are the cause of all our economic problems. And if we get you out, and you guys are bringing in different kinds of diseases, you speak a different language, you have different customs, you're not adjusting your little townships where you're gathering. Remember, these guys are basically like bachelor workers, laborers on the railroad, right? And they come in, they says, we're going to drive you all out. We're going to take everything out. And that is actually what happened. A good book to read if you have the chance to look at it, it's very concise about it, is called The Driving Out. And it is like it's by a scholar from University of California. I think she's now teaching in women's studies somewhere in here in East Coast. But Jean Thaisler, uh, take a look at her book.
Okay, put that in the notes.
She not documents the numbers of of efforts to drive people out of town. And when I talk about driving out of town, I'm talking about literally vigilante committees coming in, expelling the people physically, burning down their houses, throwing them the railroad tracks or other places to tell them to get out of town. Got X number of days, get out of town. And that's what's going on at this time. That's what happens in Truckee. That's what happens over um, all along the railroad track. So a lot of these places are now beginning to uh, re-look at that history. And that's part of what you were saying, is that all this history causes Chinese to, and the their the things that they built, whether the housing or whatever, to be destroyed or lost, right? And so you don't have anything left after 50, 60 years of this sort of stuff. It's not in your textbooks. The textbooks they barely talk about the Chinese positive contributions to the
Right. And
country.
so I want to talk a little bit about that. So
Yeah,
yeah, because clearly the building, the attacking, and these were laws that were mostly laws affecting ownership of property, setting up businesses, restricting people based on being Chinese. And so
correct. Yeah,
so what's a fascinating part of for me of this story, of this history, is that there were institutions set up, there were legal institutions, and and they fought back, and they in the California courts on some of these restrictions. I know there were one of the industries was businesses was laundromats, and they tried to limit the amount of laundromats in a certain area, and they fought back, and they actually won some of these cases as being unconstitutional restrictions statewide, but also, you know, we know that birthright citizenship is before the Supreme Court right now, and that is the notion. One of the things about the United States coming at a time when, as one of the first democracies, as one of the first inclusive constitutions certainly in the Western world, was the concept of birthright citizenship. That if you're born on United States soil, you are a citizen. And we know that that's under attack now, with the case before the Supreme Court saying that if your parents were undocumented, not necessarily. And that's something, and a lot of the world still doesn't have birthright citizenship, but that we have birthright citizenship because one man who was born here, challenged the decision of the U.S. government not to grant him citizenship based on the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, um, tell us about
So,
that case.
so first of all, let's start. I don't think the state laws were that generous, so there was a lot of success in challenges to these very anti-Chinese laws. Everything from you can't marry, you can't testify
Right.
against people.
Oh, and they lost most of the
You can't,
cases, but the fact that they challenged them, they won a couple, but the fact that they did challenge them
yeah.
was pretty
So
incredible at the time.
uh, yes, and we can talk about that even further when we talk about some of the ch other uh, uh, um, some of the education programs that are challenged in the 1930s and so forth. By the time of the 1800s and so forth, is where people were driving out people, and it was affirmed that you could do this. And the passage of the 1882 law was largely because to have a national law that that covered or gave them cover to do what they want, expelling Chinese or preventing from attending schools and so forth. So the or buying anything as mundane as buying insurance, things of the sort like that. So anyway, so we don't want to be too positive about all those charges. After all, the Supreme Court also affirmed that the 1882 law was actually valid
Yep.
because of sovereignty issues, right? But in any case, it's an interesting that the Wong Kim Ark case, and I had said this at the beginning, that even more important than the immigration laws, which can be selective and change over times and stuff like that, but the one thing about the Chinese exclusion laws, it said that Chinese, because they are Chinese, could not become American citizens. There's a long history of why that comes about. If you want to read a book by how that the state legislatures and the arguments they made in the Federal Register is really remarkable. You should read it because so many times when you read about Chinese American history or ethnic studies or things of this sort, people are very careful about what they say, right? They don't want to be insulting. They want to be uh, too open about it. But in those days, you really did have some people that said these guys can't eat rice, you can't do all this sort of stuff. They were just total squat. So read those books because that history, that testimony in a book called Forbidden Citizens. Uh,
Hmm.
Take a look at that book, and it has transcripts from the congressional record to talk about these things. In any case, by the challenge to the court, the challenge that talked about birthright citizenship was brought together not by a single individual, but by the largely an organization that represented what we probably what we call the six companies, or the representative today we call it Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. I have a little anecdote about how Wang Mark, who is the case, a person named Wang Mark is born in the United States, goes to China, stays there for a while, comes back, and can come back because he's an American citizen, right? And then later on, he goes back again for another trip, comes back, and then at that time, immigration, which is at that time administered by Department of Commerce, challenges it, says that you cannot come in because even though you were born in the United States, you were born to parents who are not subject to, who are not citizens, right? They were living here, but they were not citizens. In those days, we didn't distinguish green cards or anything. It was just sort of like they were subject to uh, Chinese law. That was the argument, and that's a current argument today, where we talk
Yes.
about it's you can be born here, but you have to be born here to legal residents or citizens, right? That's the argument they're trying to do. But the Supreme Court then and repeatedly has said, no, the plain language of that birthright citizenship comes from the 14th Amendment. It just says anyone who was born in the United States and subject to the American laws is a citizen. That there's no question about that. That's what it is, except under if you're an invading army or something like that. So that was the basis, and that decision was determined on this case by this person named Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark is truly a phenomenal decision, right? Because it affirmed birthright citizenship, which is fundamental to our American definition of ourselves, right? And it's been repeatedly challenged. And until this year, this actually it's on the Supreme Court uh, docket right now. It should
Yes.
be making a decision in a short while about whether or not that principle stays and or whether or not you go back to what has been was argued then and what is argued now, that your parents have to be either legally here or an American citizen for you to inherit that citizenship. The very and that is exactly what you're saying, Mark. There are
Early
very,
founding.
very few countries in the world that have birthright citizenship. So it's not inconsistent with what
Yeah.
other people say. But I would argue this, that it is the one thing that makes America exceptional. If you
Yes.
and
As an idea.
exceptional in many, many ways. And one of
It's
them is
yeah.
that we believe that a person, you and me, are equal.
Well,
At
and
the
this is the
time,
thing. This
yeah,
is the thing that even in the day,
yeah,
in the 1880s, when the Chinese were here, I mean, it's not that there has been many periods where racism hasn't been so prevalent in our history as we
correct.
see, but that was the era of the end of Reconstruction, the South being basically ceded back to the Klan,
Mhm.
that it was the era of, probably the worst wealth inequality, and it was you know before unions came. It was when workers were heavily exploited, and violence was extremely prevalent against, I mean, certainly against American Indians, certainly against African Americans in the South, certainly, that whole period from around the turn of the century. And yet still, and this is the hope I think that's important, is that still in that kernel you had a Supreme Court that was laden with racists. This was the same Supreme Court era that said that Chinese people were not white, as when I was teaching immigration history and ethnicity at Maryland as an adjunct about a decade and a half ago. I had the students, it wasn't a law class, but they read these cases for precisely the language you're talking about that was in Congress, where they were using phrenology, studying the size of brains, and you
Yes.
had like these Supreme Court justices deciding who was equal to be segregated as black and who wasn't, and Chinese were segregated, and Chinese went to did not go to white schools, and so that was, and South Asians and were, but Syrians weren't, and it was just this really crazy, extreme racism happening there, and yet still there were some in the legal community in the United States said, no, this isn't what we're going to do. And it was really seminal because it was, as you said, before that, there was really no, there was nothing to regulate immigration. So
It's
it's
really, it really is amazing, and you should talk about this period before you get into the Gilded period later on. And basically, Theodore Roosevelt was saying things like, "You can't have America's population overrun by the Mongolian hordes." But this is the strong period of the eugenics movement. So
yes,
on the basis of say scientific evidence, then you have these different levels of race and so forth that can show who is above and who is below. That the issue of eugenics becomes part of the idea how to address the Japanese internment issues and so forth like that. And eventually, eugenics gets disowned. But that was a strong movement here. But the 1882 law stated very firmly that it wasn't a if I can remember, Mark, it wasn't actually a unanimous decision. There were decisions in it that said basically just the language, just read the language of the 14th Amendment. And there's no way that you can interpret it other than say if you're born in the United States, then you're an American citizen, as long as you're subject to the laws of the United States. But I would argue that that is the one thing, as I've always said, that allows us to become an exceptional country, and that allows us to get out of arguments that keep reoccurring. I just gave a talk at a UC. I was talking about, the argument of who can become an American has been
Yes.
there since Benjamin Franklin talked about Germans being unsuitable to be in Pennsylvania and should be excluded. But that
I
keeps
mean,
coming up
Irish
and
need
coming up.
not apply.
Exactly.
There are no immigrant groups that have been welcomed
Yeah.
well, but
Yeah.
Ted, we're gonna take a pause and finish this as part one and come back for a